Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter and of the American Planning Association, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, February 16th, and we will hear Adapting to Climate, Urban Landscape Transformation in the 21st Century. If you have any questions, you can type those in the Q&A box. We will get to the content questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. If you do have some technical questions, you can type them in that Q&A box as well, and I'll do my best to help you. Today's guest hosts it's a joint effort between the ENRI division, Environment, Natural Resources, and Energy division, and the Water and Planning Network. I guess it's kind of you'll hear about it. It's underneath ENRI, and you'll hear more about this from Bill, but we thank you both. You've joined us before for joining us today. Coming up on your screen is a list of some of our upcoming webcasts. To register for these and all of our upcoming sessions, be sure to head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session is worth 1.5 CM credits and one of the required sustainability and resilience credits. So to log those, head over to planning.org. Log into your My APA account, and from there you can search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website. Again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And if you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when we have new sessions available for you to register for, things like that. And we record all of our sessions. We post them to our YouTube channel. So head over to YouTube and type in Planning Webcast. Will pop up along with our almost 500 session recordings, all available for free. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you get notified when a new session is available for viewing. So that's the end of my housekeeping. Again, if you have content questions, you just type those in that Q&A box, and we'll get to that at the end of the Q&A. We don't have any kind of hand raising option, so be sure to just type those questions into that Q&A box. And with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Bill, to kick things off, set the stage, all that good stuff. So take it away.
Thank you, Christine. And I'd like to extend thanks to Ohio APA and APA National, as well as the Environment, Natural Resources, and Energy Division of the Water and Planning Network. Is an interest group at APA. And if you flip this slide, Marianne, I can give you a little background on that. It's a network of water and land use professionals. It was created by the APA. It comes out of an initiative that we started back in 2014. So we're celebrating our 10th anniversary. You don't need to be an APA member to join, and that's important because we're trying to be interdisciplinary. There are about 500 network members. We have newsletters about every 2 months, and we try to have about 4 webinars a year. We consider ourselves sort of an aggregator compilation group of compiling best practices for water and land use planning, as well as an educational group through these webinars. And there are in-person meetings at conferences. We had several presentations at the APA National Conference in Philadelphia last year, as well as helping the American Water Resources Association with their summer conference on water and land use planning connecting. So there are great opportunities for educational interaction. There are publications on water and planning issues. You see to the right, the Planners and Water Planning Advisory Service report, which I helped coordinate for APA. And next. We also have some links. If folks want to join the group, you can reach us at water@planning.org. You can also sign up at the APA website. You can follow us on LinkedIn. And then on the social media platform, formerly known as Twitter, we also have a presence. So we welcome you. And Before we get going today, I'd like to introduce Paul Lander. Um, he is a PhD, he has a PhD in geography, and he has a master's of landscape architecture. He's also LEED certified, and he was the project lead on this work. Paul has been engaged in resource conservation work for more than 40 years, with a particular focus on urban landscapes and water systems. He is active in the American Water Resources Association, the Alliance for Water Efficiency, and the American Planning Association, and probably 12 more organizations that are too numerous to list. He's also currently Associate Professor Adjunct at the Department of Geography and faculty of the Masters of Environmental program at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he teaches about sustainable systems. So today we would like to contribute to what APA's recent trend scouting report called upskilling in this sphere. And I'll turn it over to Paul now.
Thank you, Bill, for that introduction. Thank you, Christine and Marianne. And thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about this work. It's an opportunity to dive a little bit more into what's happening in urban landscapes across the United States, particularly in the West, as water becomes a bigger issue, either too much of it or too little, as I say to my geography students. So there's an opportunity to learn from what other cities are doing. We don't have to reinvent this. The good news about water is that we're all in the same boat. We really all have to figure it out one way or another. The work we're going to focus on today will certainly provide lots of context to the work. That's what geographers do, is really looking at trying to help you as urban planners and the water managers you interact with. How do we direct that change needed to create climate adapted landscapes in our urban areas? And we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically. And this work looked at three primary areas, kind of legislation that's happened. That kind of directed some more attention to this, looking at specifically at ordinances and those kinds of things. And then looked at the academic literature too. The good news for all of us is that there have been more and more good science that's taken place in urban areas to help us understand the dynamics of what's going on, particularly as we're impacted by climate change in a variety of different ways. And as I say at the end, there's more than 100 references in the annotated bibliography affiliated with this work that you can access and look at that and kind of get the short and sweet of what the key elements are in those works. So if you want to look into that, you don't have to go through the whole ones. Find those things that are most relevant to you. Next slide. So just to give you some sense, as teachers like to do, let's tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then tell you what I told you. So the executive summary really is trying to look at this, and if nothing else you take away, like everything else, this is an ecosystem, and it's got bioregional natural components that has a lot of cultural components, and we'll talk about both of those. So this urban ecosystem is what we're going to try to focus on today. And so one of the takeaways for you as planners is you don't know your frames, the bioregion, the codes and regulations, those cultural things that help shape what our cities look like. The second one, in terms of looking at climate adaptation, is update all the codes now. What's the applicability? What are your definitions? Do you really require professionalism for operating this? And I'll articulate a little bit more on those, why those are important and potentially have been overlooked in the past. Also, I think planners are particularly good at being team leaders. And so you may get this more that some of the water managers out there or others struggling with what all this changes, but you really need to create and engage a team to help you. You've got your planning staff, you understand that, but you also know within organizations, public works staff, utilities, water, quality staff, we'll talk a little bit more about that, parks, staff, arborists, those kinds of things. But also, I would say externally, there's lots of landscape professionals across a spectrum, and the extension service that's in almost every county in the United States, right? So the good news is, as we identify this as an ecosystem and all the elements thereof, there are sister professionals who want to step up and help us with this. A lot of the change, particularly in the West, but in many places, has been driven by water, which is why we're looking at the Water Planning Network being a part of this. But there's lots of other elements, and you all deal with various aspects of that, which we'll talk about this. And like anything else, we want to remember to utilize adaptive management, right? We have to measure things to manage them, and then we want to be able to find systems that are flexible. We all know that. We've been hit over the head with that idea, but that's clearly the idea of a resilient future is the ability to adapt. Next slide. So for those of you who thought about, we had a conversation the other day, thinking about landscape, somebody's front yard, that seems awful like kind of a micro scale. It is in some sense, but to give you some context there, those of you who relate to the urban environment more as a transect or a continuum, on the bottom right here, you can see, just one way that people have sectioned off the transect from natural zone through rural to the urban core. Well, this work that we're going to talk about today is focused primarily on those zones T3 through T6 for a couple of reasons. One, as you know, as we go from natural to urban core, we typically see more increasing impacts on our natural systems. And also, one of the things that's driving, particularly in the West, most of these zones are also served by our centralized systems that we've set up to try to identify and work with all the different aspects of water in our life. So they end up having a lot of impact when we make changes to them because of that centralized nature. And because of those impacts, as we know, we're learning more about all the time, there are huge benefits to be gained from looking at nature-based systems. And I would say these climate adapted landscapes, we're going to talk a lot about all the way to neighborhood front yards, are nature-based systems. And we want to think about how do we make the most of that, reduce some of the demand and the cost to those centralized systems, and actually have them contribute to a broader and a more responsive urban environment. Next slide. Why now? Well, that was one of the things that led to the idea of the conversation. And Marianne and I had a conversation, and she said, you might want to look at the Babbitt Center. They're trying to ask this kind of question, like, why now? Why are all these things changing so fast, particularly in the West, but across the United States? Well, one of them, what we know, is there's a need for climate adaptation. We all understand that, right? And we'll talk more about that. There's also more of a spotlight in policy about looking at urban landscapes. We're asking more of urban landscapes than ever. And we'll hear this today more and more, right? We want them to be pollinators. We want them to catch some stormwater. We want them to help with heat abatement, right? And in lots of areas, there's particularly right now a large infusion of money from local to federal government saying we want to invest in urban environments, urban infrastructure. So it behooves us to think about getting up to grade and what are those positive changes and how do we work towards a better system, right? So there's a lot of things that are different. And I say that particularly as an older practitioner who was very much part of the xeriscape movement that some of you may have heard about, started by Denver Water in the early 80s, right? Well, why is it different now? Well, good, bad, or indifferent, climate change has changed the perspective of all of us, professionals and the people who live in your cities, right? So there's more attention recognizing we really have to step up and invest in the kinds of environments we want to have that are beneficial for habitat for all. Next slide. So that becomes really important. Just a reminder, don't have to tell you, but here's a third national climate assessment, and those are all updated, but you can see the left versus the right looking without climate change. Well, you add in climate change, and the map of the United States looks considerably different. Even places that we historically wouldn't have thought of as dry or water challenged, right? Like the Southeast, Georgia, Alabama, Florida there, the lower parts of the Mississippi, the way northeast, even the northern plains. So water challenges are in front of all of us, regardless of where you work or practice as a planner. And like I said, quite often we're trying to have some balance of too much water or too little. And we know with climate changes, things get weirder. Sometimes that's all in the same year or in consecutive years. So water challenges are real. And the APA Planning Network, makes an attempt to help us understand how do we begin to do that. And again, not to put all the burden on you all, back to one of my first points, create a team. There's a lot of other allied professionals out there who want to be a part of the solution and work with you. Next slide. So let's see if we can't work together. The other thing you all know as well, major demographic shifts happening across the United States, right? Particularly to the south and west. Those of you who are the southeast, those of you find yourselves working in the southern parts of the United States. I grew up in North Dakota. Maricopa County in 10 years added more than the state population in North Dakota in a 10-year period, right? That's significant change. So, and even you can see up in North Dakota, they had a lot because of the oil boom there, right? So demographics are always at play. And when people move, they expect to have some basic level of water services. What we're struggling to do and what we're trying to do is inform planners, help shape the conversation of what does that mean? What's a reasonable expectation for water services that communities can deliver? Next slide. So if we don't make changes, we know there's a lot of hurt in the future, right? Potentially decreased public health from heat, right? Increased heat, increased water use, increased runoff that causes all kinds of environmental degradation, water quality issues, right? Decreased habitat. So I would suggest that a lot of the ways we've developed cities have led to some of these. The good news is we're learning more about each one of these elements backed by science and coming up with strategies. And there's a lot of communities who are taking steps forward to try to address these. The good news is about, because it's an ecosystem, sometimes these strategies work together very much so in a synthetic way, synthesis. So, right, so you improve one kind of thing that actually has all these other benefits to it. And that's certainly one of the takeaways I hope you get today. Helping to increase and implement climate-friendly landscapes across the urban spectrum results in a much, much more resilient system and has multiple benefits. So while it might be driven by water too much or too little, flooding or drought, the reality is that it has these benefits and impacts for us, positive impacts across a spectrum. And we need to remember that in bringing other professions in to help with that. Next slide. So this was a slide from last summer, and pretty soon this is going to be common, right? Oh yeah, another 118-degree day in Phoenix. But that's becoming more the common across the globe, as we know, right? So these are shocking at first, but the reality is we know you look at any projection, the idea is for cities to be over 100 degrees, or in Phoenix's case, over 100 degrees, or Denver's over 90 degrees. End of the century, they all project lots and lots of days, right? So if nothing else, we realize we need an urban landscape that can help us adapt to and frankly help shield people so we do have a survivable and a ready habitat for humans and all the other things that want to live in our cities. Next slide. So first, we remember ourselves again, the frames, the bioregion. Know your bioregion, right? So, and although we focus on this case, looking at neighborhoods, particularly in a lot of the water-wise or climate-friendly programs that have been directed by water providers, particularly have focused on residential sectors. And that's because in most communities, the residential sector represents the lion's share of the water use. It may be distributed amongst tens of thousands of customers, but in some, single family and multifamily are almost always, in most cases, the majority of water used, water provided by the water agency, the water utility, EPA quality drinking water, right? So, but even at that scale, these circles help us to focus in. This is a combination of climate, vegetation, soils and topography, and all the waters. And I'll talk a little bit more what we mean by that. But, intuitively, there's more and more talking about stormwater. What about rainwater? Can we capture that? What about gray water, effluent, all those kinds of things, right? So those come into play and the kinds of things we want to have an understanding on, not necessarily a mastery. Again, you rely on your team to help with that element, but you have to have the basic vernacular to understand what things are being talked about and where the real opportunities are. Next slide. So a lot of you may have even taken some training at one point. Ian McHarg back in the late 1960s really kind of got this, was the precursor to GIS layers, if you will, right? So any bioregion is a result of all these different things. And physical planners and environmental planner, we often start with that and then overlay with a variety of different social factors. So this is just another graphical way to remind us that there is a context in which we operate all the time, even though our urban environments, especially with digital tools, we increasingly feel like we can create any world we want. Certainly in your lifetimes more than mine, AR and VR, augmented reality and virtual reality are going to become more and more common within the profession. That being said, it's still a physical world outside made up all the elements that we identify here, as well as all the cultural and social ones. So we want to remember that context and come back to that to work with that and find that there's a huge benefit by having these nature-based systems do all the wonderful things that provide for us. Next slide. We looked at the literature here in this, and I think it was important to go back, about 10 years. This isn't complete or comprehensive. Is there ever such a thing? But that being said, there's over 120 references in the review of the literature and things related to this work here. And this is just one that happens to have happened, right? So here's 2014, and more work. Los Angeles particularly has become a little bit of a hotbed for understanding the dynamics of water and land use in urban areas. And so lots of things that have been looked at. And you'll see that if you take a walk through the annotated bibliography, right? Physical elements, lots of discussion of and investigation of and better understanding of trees, right? And shade structure. They are certainly a critical element for us going forward, which begs the question, which trees? Because don't trees use water and water is shortage? Absolutely. So we have to think smart about that. How do we do that? The right tree, the right place, right? So we want to be able to do that. And the good news is there's some science that can help us with this. Native plants have gotten both more scientific attention as well as showing up in the literature and in regulation. Monitoring, both site monitoring and remote sensing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Rain gardens, social health, soil health, right? And then those social elements that I mentioned before, updating our codes, promoting landscape conversion. How do we measure and adapt? Water budget, GIS, we'll talk about that. How do we integrate with land planning? And one of the things I'll say we don't think about too often is collaborating with NGOs and community. In the water space, particularly in urban environments in the West, NGOs are leading the way. They're doing a lot of absolutely foundational work. So don't forget to include them when you're thinking about your larger community team. Next slide. So there's just a few things that I'll kind of pull out here. For example, elements work together. Trees provide shade, which reduces irrigation needs. That seems like kind of a duh. But on the other hand, sometimes you're challenged by that. When somebody at a board meeting says, well, wait a minute, don't trees use water? Well, they do, but they also can reduce irrigation needs, right? And we have science to back that up. So you can find that in Anderson and other representatives in the literature. Climate-friendly landscapes offer multiple benefits, creating a healthier habitat for all species, right? So here's another one kind of confirming what we know intuitively, but increasingly, I think we're asked as planners to back up these statements. And the good news is there's more and more science, more and more urban ecologists who help us understand these dynamics and can provide the scientific background. Like any science, it's never 100%. We don't know everything, but we know way more than we did, so I would say even 10 years ago. So the good news is science is on our side, and they're part of the folks helping to gird our projections of where we need to go in the future with our cities. Next slide. Just a few things to remember about urban water use, right? So you can see in the left here, this is from Arizona, in the West particularly, outdoor water use by far and away overwhelms almost all the water use that takes place in residences, either indoor or single family for sure. And you can see at the top there, the chart, outdoor, indoor. That's a fairly common thing. And then on the right side, you can see the dynamic represented by that orange arrow from kind of an average use, right? In a winter, in this case, this is Portland, Oregon, 20-some million gallons a day, all the way up peaking to 60, 70, right? Well, that's a huge peak demand. If you think about any other urban infrastructure, well, you have to be able to handle within the middle of every year a 3 to 5x, 3 to 5 times more capacity. That's overwhelming. And again, this is EPA quality treated drinking water in most cases. Very, very expensive. So reducing this demand has lots of other community benefits, one of which is freeing up money to spend on other things that you want to do to enhance your community, right? So on the left side, it just kind of puts it, you can relate to it any way you want to, but outdoor water use in most places across the country, even Florida. Remember that chart where we're looking at potential water squeezes in Florida? Automatic irrigation systems have become standard practice in new development, even in water-rich regions. So this thing about helping to meet and reducing this peak demand becomes a problem almost anywhere. So addressing outdoor water use is a huge issue. And really, at the end of the day, my question is, what do we get for our water, right? Well, in the bottom left, we're spending a lot of water, a lot of EPA quality treated drinking water in urban areas on outdoor landscape that may or may not be giving us all the environmental benefits that we really require. Next slide. This is just another slide showing that same kind of thing, right? Single family consumption. And as I said, this pattern is pretty typical for most communities in the West, even Seattle and Portland, which we forget have actually pretty dry summers. So they require and rely on a centralized system. Next slide. Some of you have seen this in your travels, thinking about a water-sensitive city, back to the broader Transect. What's our goal? Where are we really shooting for? Well, at the end of the day, we're trying to look at water-sensitive cities, right, that really have all of these elements in place, provide for us as human habitat, but also don't degrade our natural systems, right? And what this slide is also really trying to help us remember when we think about the one water approach that more and more water providers are looking at. What do you mean one water? Well, most of our cities, the water elements were developed one thing at a time. So for example, City and County of Denver, the water supply is Denver Water. The sewerage agency is a completely another agency. The flood area is another agency. The waterways may be another agency, right? So we also have lots of institutions that sometimes get in the way of collaboration. So there's a lot of work called One Water within the water resource protection profession. How do we work together, let alone bringing in some other folks like planners? Next slide. Well, there's been a lot of attention on urban landscapes, especially in the West. When we think about the amount of water, again, back to that peak demand chart or those 65 gallons in outdoor water use in the Western United States, there's a tremendous amount of water going there, and water providers have realized if we can reduce that demand at all, that is the cheapest new supply we can get, and also maybe we can put that money and or that water towards something that is of larger benefit, like heat abatement, like stormwater capture, like pollinator habitat, right? That kind of thing. In the last decade, California water providers have put in hundreds of millions of dollars into removing turf, right? The kind of spotlight now is in something that a lot of people call non-essential turf. The real turf hardliners say there is no such thing as non-essential, it's all essential. Yes, turf does have a benefit, but it's been, in my view, and many people, completely misapplied and put in lots of places where it's not really beneficial, right? Nobody says, come on over, let's barbecue by the curb. So there's lots of places that would be much better served with a different plant palette, as well as offering a lot of different environmental services, right? The state of Colorado has put $2 million in to help. Utah's put in $5 million. They're on their way to making that $10 million a year or so. This is the beginning of millions of dollars looking at urban landscape conversion. Some of you may have been charged with going to get some state money by your supervisors. That's not going to go away. And part of the challenge we have in front of us is what should go in its place? How do we build and invest in long-term resilient systems? Next slide. So that's a real opportunity. Well, Nevada legislature raised the bar, right? Way back beginning, they said, they're going to prohibit non-functional grass, right? The law was championed by the water agency, right? But this was a statewide law, and there's a potential savings of a huge amount of water, right, for the Southern Nevada area, which is growing very, very rapidly. So it was clear to many of us when this happened, this changed the game, right? This was a paradigm shift. And so not surprisingly, next slide, this started to take place across the country, right? So here's a landscape ordinance now back to the local level, town of Castle Rock, which is just south of the metro area in Denver. New residential changes, no turf in the front yards for new homes, right? Backyards limited to 500 square feet, right? So communities are promoting a greater plant diversity in place of turf-dominated schemes. Turf is not going away. Turf is going to be maintained in most communities, even the strictest, for socializing, common spaces, parks, rec centers, that kind of thing, where they're used actively. And I think that's probably the more practical definition of non-functional turf. Well, it has a function, but if you're not using it for that function, it may be better served in another way. Next slide. So there's a lot of money going on out there, and it's going to continue. So I'd encourage you to keep your mind on that. Find someone else on your team who's maybe keeping a close watch on that. How do we bring some money to bear? Because these changes are not inexpensive. Next slide. But they're taking place. We really need to think about that, right? So just a reiteration of that kind of thing. And if you want to follow up, there's some copies of some of these bills in the annotated bibliography. Next slide. So again, we reviewed the literature, we looked at all those things that was really, really important, and the annotated bibliography has all those references. You can find those things if you need to do a deeper dive. Next slide. That really helps you make the case. Here's another one, City of Aspen, right? The kinds of elements we see in this legislation. We were talking at the Babbitt Center. Babbitt Center is an NGO. They can't specifically say, thou shalt have this type of ordinance. But we did identify, and many others have, that there's pretty common things you see in these new water-efficient, climate-friendly landscaping standards, right? They address the kinds of things we see on the right. Some of them make sense. We've thought about that before. Trees, native vegetation, turf, but more and more, which I think is really critical, soil health and stormwater. Soil is critical for any plant material. We get that intuitively, but there's a lot of landscape ordinances that just say, thou shalt have organic material in the soil. Well, that doesn't helpful. We need really definitions and testing, that kind of thing, right? And water budgets and irrigation. Next slide. So there's some common things we can find. Well, you all know, why is this so difficult? Because this is a system, right? We see, and I would say in the metaphor in this world is the millions of dollars going into it, ripping out the turf is easy. The big question is what goes in its place? Next slide. And there's a lot of different elements and a lot of people when you include that. So just reminding you, there's a lot of folks in this urban ecosystem who are not only necessarily willing, but it's part of their mission to do that. And we'll see when we talk about multiple benefits, who really benefits and who's willing to partner with you all in making this change because it's part of their mission. Next slide. Heat has become a huge issue. We talked about that just briefly with the slide. Here's another one on the right. We know trees really carefully planting different communities makes a substantial difference for the personal experience on the ground for sure, but also the overall experience within a city and helping to abate this thing we've all heard about called the urban heat island, right? As we put in tons and tons of hard surfaces, particularly blacktop, we really increased the heat. And so we've got to find new strategies for reducing that. And how do we do that selectively? Because there's tremendous amount of benefits. And let's remember that the slide before that Anderson reminded us, you reduce that heat, you actually reduce the irrigation needs. So again, these things go hand in hand. Next slide. We also talked to a lot of professionals there, right? And not surprisingly, and many of you would echo these same sentiments, right? We need a long-term policy. This is not a one and done. And that's the feedback I would give to any of the state legislators or local ordinance folks, right? This is a paradigm. This is a generational change, just like climate in itself, right? And good news is the community, maybe because of climate change, they're kind of ahead of us. They're really interested in climate-friendly landscapes. But that requires training for planners, training for those folks on the ground, the quote green industry who's out there every day maintaining it. They've been given very different directives in the past. Mow and blow, keep it green, don't worry about the water use, right? So those paradigms have to shift. But we also know for people living in the city, aesthetics are important. We have to do this right way. Unfortunately, there's a lot of work that's been done in the last 10 years to rip out turf, only to end up with large seas of mulch or rock. And nobody wants to live in that kind of community, right? Next slide. So we really want to think about ways, how do we do that? So these aesthetics matter, right? Aspen requires the majority of the surface area in plant coverage at maturity, so you don't end up with the slide on the left. Yes, that's water saving, but we also know it's heat producing, right? And particularly as heat becomes more an issue in our higher population and population growing areas, that's really not a solution to do on the left. So not everybody wants to do as involved or abundant on the right, but certainly we can put to rest the idea that water-wise landscapes can't be beautiful, can't have blooming. We know that has been proven over and over again in the past couple of decades. Next slide. There's a lot of other folks who've helped us. Some of you may have seen some of this. The Urban Land Institute, which was a surprise to me, is based in Washington, D.C. Their sustainability division within their staff at headquarters is now the largest division, right? They have over 20 people working on sustainability. This is only one of the publications they've come up with recently to help us all think about how do we do that? And not surprising as ULI, they took a little larger picture than just the front yard kind of approach that we're looking at in a lot of climate-friendly ordinances. Next slide. And they remind us that, again, as they go out and they try to work with other folks, recognizing consumers want this kind of thing, right? They see responsible. Water's very, very important to people. Understandably, we're water beings. We can't live without it. Next slide. So lots of other our folks working out there have helped us recognize that. Just another slide that reminds us, good, better, and different. Most cities, we have a single pipe system, right? 100% potable water, although we consume, actually bring into our bodies less than 2%. So are there other kinds of waters that might actually be help us with this, right? And on the bottom right, this is a chart from Denver Water, right? Annually, more than half of their water, EPA quality drinking water, goes on landscape. In the summer months, that may be 70%. So the good news is the potential is huge if we get this right. And none of us are talking about no more turf, no more water ever outside. It's just being much more strategic with it. Next slide. And more folks are looking at these alternative water sources in the Pacific Northwest, the Chesapeake Bay, stormwater, certainly reuse, condensate, gray water, evaporative cooling. All those things are potential sources for us as we move forward. Next slide. So we want to begin to think about those. And again, some of those professionals can help us with that. And you all know the codes define the look, feel, and vision of a community, right? People respond to the direction given in the codes. And many of the professionals I talk to, particularly in California and Arizona, if the standards don't require climate-friendly landscaping, there's no incentive to change. So this is kind of a step change where we have to have policy that supports that and then invest in the communities and the professionals who need to help us with that change and kind of gradually move forward. Again, this isn't a one and done. Next slide. This is a long-term thing. Colorado, this is the one group, Water Now Alliance and Western Resource Advocates have been really promoting and trying to help local communities think about, are there large open space areas that aren't used for active recreation that could be converted to native grasses, right? So the native grass movement has really taken place across the West, more and more people realizing this is part of the suite of options. This isn't an all or nothing. This is those areas that make sense. Next slide. We look at converting to some other kind of plant material, right? And as we do this, this really is a down payment on the future, which is remembering those hundreds of millions of dollars that will be coming our way in the next decades. How do we use that to most benefit for our communities, to make climate-friendly communities for all? Next slide. San Diego requires the inclusion of stormwater capture. We're seeing that more and more, right? That becomes a common thing, recognizing back to that idea, these are addressed by centralized systems. Centralized stormwater systems really struggle with more rain, which California has just seen, right? If we don't have other broader distributed infrastructure to help us with that, these central systems are really going to struggle to keep up. Next slide. And a very simple thing I say to my students 100 times a semester, right? You have to measure to manage, right? And that's the only way we could change social norms. Unfortunately, most irrigation systems out there, right, the tested out on the ground with these little catch cans you see on the right, the tested efficiency is 55%, right? So our customers are having to buy 2 gallons of water just to get one on the plant material they're trying to grow. So San Antonio is a leader out there. They said you need to do an annual irrigation audit for all large landscapes on the right side. Well, again, that kind of makes sense. I use the piano analogy. You don't roll even a Steinway off the truck and start playing, right? You have to tune it up. Any dynamic system that is made of lots of pipes, and parts needs to be tuned up all the time. In LEED parlance, right? LEED building took them a while to realize, and finally they ended at, oh, we need to commission it. We can put all the green elements together to make a LEED building, but if we don't fine tune them so they all work together, it doesn't do that, right? So that's called commissioning in the LEED parlance. But in the water world, we're just realizing we need to get to that, right? We need to annually audit, update these things, and make sure we get the water going where we want it to go. Next slide. Increasingly, you'll see more and more stuff in the literature and better technology from the GIS remote sensing world. We can really start getting patterns of what's going on, right? So look at this, remote sensing for urban landscape management. This isn't exact, But the area here is kind of the coverage for East Bay Municipal Utility District, right? And so if they say a water-wise landscape, which one do you mean? Do you mean the cooler green area on the right side, the hot red area? So a lot of our communities, your communities, struggle with different heat regimes, different climate zones, different patterns wherever you are. GIS or remote sensing can help you get some understanding to that and recognizing we can differentiate our standards and help people really where they are. Next slide. We need to rethink storage. And this is not a take. We need storage in anybody in the Western United States, anyone in a dry region, even Florida. We need storage, right? It helps us ride out the highs and lows. But again, thinking that always being centralized, the landscape itself can help us. On the bottom right, some of you may have read or seen Brad Lancaster's work. This is in Tucson, Arizona, the bottom right, where the average rainfall is 11 inches or less. All of that vegetation you see is completely fed by rainfall. There's no treated water put on that. They only use treated water in the house. Well, maybe that's too woolly and wild, but one of the things Brad and his brother were trying to show is we can have lots of ledge vegetation if we just get much better at harvesting and keeping our soil moisture, right? And in the top right there, remembering our physical science, there's way more, 60 times more soil moisture available across the globe than there is in rivers, right? But as humans, we tend to see if we can't see it, there's no water there. Well, we have a lot of potential in rethinking these kinds of resources. Next slide. Landscape can provide a variety of services, and we're asking more than ever, right? So again, in the trends, we're seeing ordinances and people directing to have more tree density and more strategic placement to provide heat abatement and those other environmental services that we know that trees can help with. Next slide. So we want to always keep that in our back pocket, recognizing that's the kind of thing to do, right? This is a place in Denver. Most of the immediate front yards here are fairly waterized. The turf on the right, I probably would go through depending how wide that strip is. But again, historically, everything you see in there would have been turf. So there's been a little bit of a slow change. Sometimes they have a little still the tree lawn on the right. And that's something we need more research and practice to think about how do we address those. But this is becoming much more the norm. These are brand new homes. And again, for a lot of those citizens, they don't want to be slaves. They don't want to be ones who have to take care of so much of our landscape. They want to be out enjoying the natural world, particularly in the West, but any of the southern areas, right? People are moving there because of the weather. Well, then don't make me have to do my maintenance 40 hours a week. Next slide. LA's done a lot, but also they have huge issues to challenge, challenges ahead of them, right? Next slide. So we see more and more stuff, and the LA Times particularly has had pictures like we seen back there. Here's another group in Colorado thinking of, again, a continuum. Front yard, almost nobody recreates there. Pretty low water, very low maintenance. Right up in middle slide, small patio, blacktop, usable area to the right. Turf grass, certainly the recreation is high water turf itself repairs very well, but all the common areas can be in something else, right? So again, it's not an all or nothing. It's a continuum. Next slide. So the most optimistic is we build these climate resilient urban landscapes and we improve public health. We provide shade. We optimize our water use. We provide plants for pollinators. We capture stormwater. Next slide. We do more and more of these things where cities really become a part of it. The water budget may be a new concept to some of you. It's been adopted by a few dozen agencies around the United States. I'm not sure why I'm not more. But the whole idea is, how much water should I use? Well, upper left there, we can see we can now very easily with GIS discern what area is in landscape and then give it an allocation. So on the right here, we allocate. So the indoors, 5,000 gallons a month in this case. This is Boulder. And you can see from the bar charts, we allocate more water in the summer than in the shoulder months because the outside landscape needs more water then, right? And then the allocation is 15 gallons for every square foot of landscape, which we can calculate. So if you have a large lot, you have a bigger allocation than I do, but our allocation is equitable because it's 15 gallons square foot for every square foot. And more agencies have done that. Next slide. So we began to look at that, and this is another one. This is Boulder, where you have a water budget, and then you get your bill and it tells you the actual usage, right? And so there's a little bit of measure and report and some education that happens here. On the bottom, you can see if you stay within your base rate and you're within the 100% budget, the charge is very reasonable. If you go over that, there's a very, very quick price signal that tells you. Next slide. And in Irvine Ranch, California, who really took this to task after one of the big droughts in the late 80s, they had a huge change, right? You can see starting at the bottom, the public landscapes in 20 years doubled, but the total water use increased less than 4%. And their average use declined because they had a budget. They had a very specific goal that entire team we talked about was all trying to reach a goal. What was the upshot of that? Well, you can see in the slides, right? We've changed the plant palette from something on the left that was absolutely generic along any roadway in the United States to the right where it's much more relevant and climate friendly for the climate in which it finds itself, right? So, and in their case, they've done lots of surveys, very high community satisfaction. You go to the soccer fields in the same town, they're all grass, they're all watered, they're really well taken care of. And some people might say, well, you know, that allows us to take care of those recreation areas better because we're not distracted by trying to maintain all these little acres and acres of silly strips along roadways. Next slide. Denver Parks and Recreation just shared with us a couple of months ago. They're, you know, all these benefits that they're seeing on these non-recreation, non-active use areas that just are become really, really important to people. And they're recognizing that, again, there's a lot of acceptance, really helps them take care of their large inventory of lands within the Parks Department by having more of a continuum of the kind of plant materials they implement and maintain. Next slide. The multiple benefits. This is one I encourage you to really dive into more. This is care of a group called Environmental Incentives. Both Chad Prawl and Megan Cherry, who work there, have been really fundamental in working with San Diego County. What I want you to see here across the top there, programs, SoCal Water Smart, San Diego Water Authority. The other circle is the Water Quality Authority. So one of the things they've kind of, you know, broken the ground here of now all of a sudden the water quality people want to be a part of this because in San Diego County, the EPA regulates outfall to the ocean. And if San Diego doesn't clean that up, they get fined. So water quality people are quite excited. If you remember those slides before, the 55% tested efficiency, water all over the roadway, well, that's the bane of existence for water quality people, right? All that excess irrigation runoff takes water quality down the drain literally and reduces the quality of the waters, right? So they have an incentive, and in this case, they have literally said, we want to be part of the solution. We're going to put some money on the table. So part of the message for water agencies or planners, cast a net as broad as you can. Lots of people want to be a part of this, but someone's got to take the lead. Next slide. And their program has been very, very successful, right? They do a lot of measurement and report a lot back about what's happened to folks. So these are the kinds of things. Very bottom right? Dry weather flow reductions, 9 acre-feet per year, right? So there's a tremendous amount of water that's been kept from going into the ocean with lots of pollutants. And so the water quality people are pretty excited about this. Next slide. If you don't know about Earth economics, I'd encourage you to look at their website, not to promote them individually, but they, like many economists now, are doing very, very good work for us who've always struggled to have good quantitative data to be able to back up these things which we knew intuitively, right? So we know trees have a benefit, but how much of a benefit? And what's the split between, what about air quality versus sequestering carbon? Are they good for stormwater? That kind of thing, right? So here's a report they did that really helps affordable housing. Again, the infrastructure, the nature-based systems providing benefit that don't take dollars away from putting into affordable housing, right? Lots of good information here for you to utilize as you move forward. Next slide. Here's another one they did on converting a blacktop landscape in the LA area, right? All the way down to what the initial land cover is, what the benefits are, numbers to that. Now, nobody's going to suggest these numbers are golden. There's plus and minus, there's errors, range of error in any kind of estimation. But this is the first time we've been able to get much more specific and actually put a specific amount of money, right? Look at that heat mitigation, up to $120,000 in heat mitigation from new trees, right? So these kinds of numbers really help us in our argument of both broadening the discussion to this landscape transformation across the urban transect has multiple benefits in a bunch of multiple areas, and we want to invite everybody in to be able to benefit from that and be a part of creating the solution. Next slide. Lots of great information out there on the web if you're kind of looking for, and every landscape is a little different. Everybody has different tastes, but these conversions are happening big time, and they're resulting in tremendous water savings, all the other benefits we kind of talked about. Next slide. Most of the water districts in California, particularly, but Arizona, Colorado, Utah, have pretty good portfolios of imagery on their websites to let people know what some of the options are should they decide to make the change. Next slide. And more of the green infrastructure ones, some of you may know this. This is the Sidwell School in Washington, D.C., where the Obama girls went during that presidency. And every day the students walk into the building over the water treatment system, right? This is a natural wastewater treatment system. So again, as we bring in more and more nature-based systems into our cities, not only do they help defray costs that go to centralized systems, help optimize centralized systems by reducing some of the peak demands on them, but also begin to educate and help people understand that these can be part of our daily environments. These are good habitat for humans and all other species. Next slide. Collaboration means greater outcome. Stacked incentives. Next slide. Not surprising, Larson out of the University of Arizona, landscape regulation could benefit from more multi-objective collaboration. That's exactly what they're doing in San Diego, and they identify in this work, some examples where people have begun to do that. And I recognize this is hard work, right? People have talked about the water energy nexus forever. Well, getting energy and water people together to talk, sometimes within the same agency, is a difficult discussion. One of the things the APA Water Land Alliance has been trying to do is bring land and water people together more, right? Not always easy discussions. What do we do and how do we begin to do that? But both the science out there as well as lots more and more case studies all the time, including many in that ULI publication of the unbelievable benefits we reap by doing that kind of collaboration. Next slide. Here's another one looking at the stacked benefits of sustainable landscapes from environmental savings, looking at San Diego. Look at that irrigation management, turf replacement, right? Huge reductions in dry weather flows. And dry weather flows are just what they sound like, right? It flows down into a storm system that come almost exclusively from irrigation, not from rainfall. Next slide. Locally in Colorado, we've got a nonprofit that has grown tremendously with something called Garden in the Box. Lots of consumers, lots of customers, citizens want to do something, but they're pretty intimidated. I'm not a plant person. What grows well with what? How do we make that go, right? So they've created essentially plant by number, typical 10 by 20 area. The designs are professionally made for you. The plants are specifically chosen out. You pick up all the plants, you go home. So that's a weekend planting thing, right? So in 22, they had over 9,400 Garden in a Box units sold. In 23, that was up to 12,000. People cannot get enough of trying to be part of the solution in their own yards. Next slide. So again, the takeaways for planners: know your frames, the bioregion, know what your codes and regulations are. Are they supporting the way you want to be in the future, what your community wants to look like in 2040, 2050? And by all means, update all those codes now. And by that, I mean specifically in the West, we've had a few communities that jumped on the bandwagon and started giving money to rip out turf, but the landscape code still promoted turf and practices that weren't sustainable, weren't climate friendly. So make sure you have some orientation of that. And like San Antonio, requiring irrigation audits of large landscapes really set a new standard for professionals. They're willing to step up, but not if it's anything goes, because that just creates chaos, right? And create and engage your team, right? There are a tremendous amount of people that are really qualified, very committed people who'd love to be part of that. And I would suggest, like the San Diego example, water quality, arborists, people who are native plant, pollinators folks, they'd love to be a part of it, but typically they don't have the kinds of money or capital or access to it that water or wastewater or water quality agencies might. So those agencies can take the lead, but be open to inviting any other players. You end up with a much more robust system, right? And so let's measure things and let's look at using adaptive management. Next slide. I said before, here's San Diego. Most people, oh, I'm not sure what that's going to look like if we rip out the grass. Well, I would love this if this was my neighbor, right? So incredibly, aesthetics are important. Has a lot of functionality to this kind of landscape, way more than the turf only, provides benefits across the spectrum. And more people say, I want to have this in my community and in my neighborhood. Next slide. The professionals want to be a part of it too, but we need to invest in them. That includes all you as planners, as well as the green industry and anyone else involved in this, right? This is a paradigm shift. We're going to change the look of our landscapes, the functioning of our landscapes. We have to change those mechanisms, those elements of the system that have led us to where we are today if we want it to look different, right? Next slide. A lot of you probably have followed the work in Philadelphia when they went big on the green infrastructure versus gray. But I always say, I remember seeing a presentation, not only the day after they adopted, we're going to go with green infrastructure, they also walked over to the community college and started developing training programs, as well as training their own staff within the city of Philadelphia, right? We have to do all that. And a lot of you, some of you may have taken part in the Growing Water Smart work by the Babbitt Center and the Sonoran Institute in the West. More and more native plant things. The Theodore Payne Foundation, a nonprofit. Again, lots of nonprofits out there very interested in helping you to make this transition and making communities that work for all of us. Next slide. Castle Rock, Colorado requires professionals to have a qualified water efficient landscape program. That's one of 3 or 4 EPA certified inspections. So again, they're trying to raise the bar. Not just anyone can work in our community, because we have goals in our community for the look and the functioning and the demands from our landscape. Next slide. Change is difficult. Please bring as many people in as you can. Planners, I think, are really well versed in that and understand that. Next slide. Again, remembering, yes, we focused a lot all the way down to kind of front yards, but the idea about urban ecology will tell us if that's the matrix, and again, in most communities, if that is the bulk of where treated drinking water is distributed, well, it makes sense to look at those landscapes, right? In aggregate, it's really important because they're part of the transect, they're different, they're not the urban core, but they have tremendous impacts on our centralized systems, but also represent a tremendous amount of opportunity. Next slide. We've done this before. Thank you for looking at this. The urban ecosystem is changing. It's dynamic. It always has been. There's a lot of opportunities and challenges for planners, but there's a lot of resources out there to help us move forward. Next slide. Please visit the report that was authored for the Babbitt Center with help from Mary Ann, supported a lot by the work. A lot of great people who are part of this planning network were involved in that. Next slide. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll turn it over for questions.
Paul, thank you for that great presentation. We have a little bit of time here for Q&A. Before we jumped into that, I wanted to emphasize a few things, some notes I took during your presentation. One is that the report, and several folks asked in the Q&A for references and links and citations. And your report, your and Mary Ann's report that's hosted by Babbitt Center for Land Use Policy does have extensive bibliographic information. Is that correct?
Correct, yes. If you go to the, on Babbitt Center, the Lincoln Institute, Babbitt Center is a part of the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy. You go to that website, you can find our publication, and the link has the landing page for that has both a link to the body of the report as well as a link to the annotated bibliography.
Great, thank you. Also, a couple questions had come up, and it also occurred to me during your discussion that local governments especially are going to need financial help, especially those that need to retrofit these kinds of green improvements to their towns. When it comes to new development, you can always work through the development ordinances and the developers to try to have some of the improvement funded. But in areas where there's that are already built out essentially. Um, you're going to need financial help. And I just want to say that the Source Water Collaborative, which is funded by EPA, has a series of webinars on funding using the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act to help implement some of these programs moving forward. Now, the big question is most of the money is going to states, and how are the states going to implement this fund distribution? So contact your state environmental agency and press them if you're interested in finding financial help for that. Another item that came up was somebody asked about how do we train people and how do we begin to implement this? Are the horticulture folks and the growers getting tuned up? And I know you mentioned Philadelphia as one example. They have a sustainable business network that conducts training programs for landscapers. They work with growers. So there are many programs available through sort of workforce training, which is a big evolving component of this green infrastructure programming. And let's see, the other is that I thought it would be useful to emphasize creating champions in local communities. A lot of this isn't going to happen unless we have local champions. And we see through environmental commissions, local groups, watershed nonprofits, that there's a great groundswell of interest in folks moving ahead on this and working with their local city council, town council, municipal council to begin to implement a lot of the programs that you had talked about. So with that, any other comments, Marianne or Paul, before we?
Now let's jump into the questions. I see we have quite a few.
We do. We have a number of questions.
If I could add one thing, Bill, on your thing about funding.
Yes.
One of my slides had some work that was done by Water Now Alliance and Western Resource Advocates. Western Resource Advocates is another NGO, works in the Intermountain West. They have a great publication that specifically looked at how to use turf conversion. And they go through state water quality, state revolving funds, typical bonds, all those things, and helping you understand what those mechanisms are. Now, you're right. You have to work with those officials to help them with sometimes re-look at what the definitions are, but potentially there can be monies out there, especially, and that's why I say this work at really getting the good economics of the multiple benefits that can really help change the tenor of the conversation.
Multiple benefits are the key there. I agree. What we're finding is a little bit of a challenge in that the states seem to be seeking applications for loans, and then those loans could be forgiven or become grants, and people are very reluctant. And there's actually not a lot of local capacity in most cities to apply for this money. So, and small cities especially. So let's get to the questions. The first question on my list here is there a reason Alaska was not looked at? Do you have a quick answer for that?
No, that was certainly, as a geographer, that's a mea culpa, right? Bad on me for just getting the continental US, because the reality is, on the ground, Alaska has challenges like everyone else. They look different than everyone else, but I would suggest they have fewer urban areas, but let's say greater Anchorage or even Fairbanks, right? They have challenges. And so the urban landscape that we've created may be exacerbating those climate challenges, right? So part of the idea is how do we dive in and understand those urban dynamics so that Anchorage 2050, it does look different and it's a little bit more responsive. So mea culpa on that.
Okay, I also see that we have 22 questions here, and I'm concerned that we may not get to all of them, but Paul, is it fair to say that we could produce some follow-up to this?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Second question, how does agricultural and industrial use of water compare to residential?
Well, good question. And my students bring that up all the time. In the Western United States, particularly, and globally, agriculture, 70 to 90%, depends on the state, right? So they are the huge user of water. Now, many would argue that's a very productive use because that's what we eat, whereas are the urban landscapes as productive? Now, as we move to more and more environmental benefits, we get to toot a horn a little bit on that. That being said, the reason to pay attention is that cities are growing, and cities are the ones who have money, and they are changing the water landscape by what they can purchase and buy. Cities are perennials. Farms are annuals. They can be fallowed. You can't fallow a city. So politically, and water use growth is driven a lot of places by cities. And so certainly there's an opportunity to work together. And we're going to see more and more agriculturalists saying, we want urban conservation because that helps us as well, right? So, but let's not pretend that that's the tail wagging the dog here. Agriculture has its own challenges. There specifically was part of the urban look, but it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I know that they talk about fallowing crops, but there's been a lot of controversy about nut trees and
Right.
that you can't fallow them, but yet they have enormous water use. So that's a
Right.
discussion probably for another time.
Right.
Um, Please discuss use of zoning or impact fees to manage future climate adaptive new development. So how would we begin to apply some of the zoning and impact fees?
Well, for example, in Douglas County, where Castle Rock is located just south of the Denver metro area, they have literally zoned their county based on water availability. So they have a map that literally says if you build in the A zone, um, you have a very, very limited access to water supply, and you have to the develop, have to bring in 90% new fresh water renewable, all the way to where we have more reliable water supplies. So we do see some zoning applications that way, where people have recognized sometimes there are very much um, spatial issues about water availability. Historically, with the engineering we have, California particularly, we just move water wherever we want, right? But that being said, and some of these ordinances come in, for example, City of Aurora, east of Denver, is growing tremendously. Their landscape ordinance changes the game substantially for new development. So those are going to look quite different. No new golf courses, no commercial industrial areas, those kinds of things, right? So those are, I would say, overlays more than necessarily a zoning ordinance to begin to kind of change that tenor. So that can happen, and that's going to be dependent on the community. And again, I'd encourage you to look at the bibliography. More and more communities are trying to ask that question. What does that look like an area? And again, I'd say also take the long-term view. Frankly, don't make all your citizens mad at you tomorrow. You're shooting for 2050. So this is going to be a long-term transition. This is a paradigm shift. But you move too far too fast, and then we have the French farmers situation.
And I just wanted to add a little thing about impact fees. That's an important tool. It could be used
Hmm.
very definitely, especially if what you're assessing your fee on is tied to what you've already adopted in your local ordinances and in your master plans. So yes, that's definitely a financial tool that's available to you.
And Marianne, you've also have some experience with NetBlue programs where in some towns, no new water development is allowed and you need to, you know,
Well, the new development has to offset its water use. I mean, it's not
exactly.
that the new development is prohibited, it's that they must offset their water use. And so there are a number of communities around the country that do it in different kinds of ways, do it through ordinances, do it through offsets, do it through purchase of water rights. Paul has mentioned a couple of examples. So water neutral development is one way to keep the water use down and make sure that the underlying landscapes are consistent with the hydrology of the area and encourage water efficient landscape water use. So it all can tie together.
Yeah, and I
Great.
would say, Bill, that's one of the answers to your question before, how do people take care of the existing landscape? That's one thing with new development. Well, if you have any development, they're incentivized, they want to build. And so the
Yeah,
net zero is like, well, then they can invest in helping some of these existing landscape transitions,
right,
right?
right. That credit that they get for helping offsite other properties be more water efficient, that can be applied to a new development credit. So it all kind of ties together.
Yeah.
Great. Um, this is an interesting question. Isn't drinking water a low percentage of uses because most people drink soda and bottled water and other types of drinks? And I'm a adjunct a professor at Rutgers Blaustein School of Planning, and my students often ask about this. And I ask folks, do they know how much, water costs for a household typically? And most don't. And it's in the range of $2 to $5 per 1,000 gallons if you're buying it from your local water utility, whereas you're paying $1 a liter if you're buying it at the store. So the sense though is in the industry side that bottled water use is expanding because people are, don't have the trust that they need to have in the local water utilities. So do we see an expansion of water use at the household level for drinking water and domestic uses, or do we see that stabilizing or decreasing?
Well, that's a complicated question. A lot of elements of that. A couple short answers, and Peter Glick, a water professional, has written a whole book on that kind of thing. Bottled water use is increasing. So seltzers, those kinds of things, people are moving more to that than soda. Very recently, in the last month, there's a lot of issues with bottled water. One, because it's regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, not water quality.
It's
So
not under the Safe
whereas
Drinking Water Act, right?
right, yeah. Whereas your local water provider has to do 10,000 tests a month, food products and not something. And the reality of when they are tested, there's some real problems. But I understand the trust issue. And so clearly it's not an economic because people will pay 10,000 X for that hand bottled water, right? And
Exactly.
so part of the trust thing. That being said, I don't see any water providers historically. There's a lot of water use reduction. In fact, it's typically an increase from landscape or big showers, those kind of things. So drinking water isn't going to go away. And I would say, I haven't seen the numbers. Good question. I would still say bottled water is a minority of the water that people drink. There's just a lot of customers who can't afford that. Almost everybody buys it for convenience here and there, but you can't rely on it, as the people in Detroit unfortunately found out, for all your other household needs. It's just too expensive.
I
Exactly.
think what's at the heart of that question is the amount of bottled water being bought going to reduce the amount of drinking water consumption? The answer to that is no.
Right.
We are not seeing that as a reduction because the amount of water that people actually drink is a very small percentage of what water they actually use
Total
in their
household
house.
use.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a question here about, is there a trend to move away from trees in the xeriscape tree area between the back of the curb and the sidewalk? Our water department is pushing for this. The department suggests that trees die more often and that irrigation is not efficient in the curbside areas. Um, any comments about sort of the landscape approach and use of trees? I know that in the work that I do with Philadelphia on their green infrastructure and their Green City Clean Waters, there's a shift much more from a highly variegated planting palette to more grasses and a monoculture that's easier to maintain. The maintenance costs become a big issue.
Right. Well, again, there's a lot written on that. I would encourage you to look at the bibliography, a lot of really good science, and a couple things, again, loaded into that. Yes, the way we historically have put trees in little funny 2-foot strips, it's problematic. Street trees have a very, very tough life. Average street tree in New York City, 7 years, right? Very, very tough environment. But there's been a lot of people who looked at things called structural soils, or how do we give the root zones a better thing a chance? And so I would suggest it's not going away because the heat issue is overwhelming lots of cities. We're going to need more trees, more vegetation than not. That being said, we need to do it smarter. And so when we had a drought here in Colorado and California, we're trying to move to, if trees are really important, you have an irrigation system, typically drip, for the trees. And then what else can get along with it? 100% of the time, we make irrigation systems for turf and hope the trees can get along. And they don't. And they really struggle, especially in that little 2-foot
Yeah.
strip up by the street, right? So again, that's back to, it's a system thing. Don't blame it on the tree. Maybe it's the wrong tree, wrong place. There's the things that go in place. And the good news is we know how to do it, but we have to actually make sure that we have those kinds of standards. So again,
Yeah.
what do you get for your water? I'm getting a lot of benefit because we're doing it all the right way.
And we're getting smarter about those planting plans.
Absolutely.
I think so.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the extreme heat. I know I'm in New Jersey, and New Jersey just rolled out a survey, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, their extreme heat resilience action plan. And they sent out a survey to everybody on their mailing list to get feedback on extreme heat impacts in the state. And this is a first that I've seen, and it's toward the development of an extreme heat action plan. So it'll be interesting to see how all this couples with the water environment.
Absolutely. And again, that's come up many places in the West, particularly. Well, why are we even putting water on trees? Well, again, the literature will show trees are almost other than growing food, are probably the second in terms of return we get for our urban environments, right? And that's not to downplay turf grass, it has its place. But
Yeah.
when you're thinking about a continuum, unless you want to literally live in a desert, we're not going to not have trees. We need more vegetation, but we need you to be smarter.
Another question here, can you please talk about practices and ideas for addressing hardscape that causes too much water runoff and adds heat? And they talk about parking lots and turf fields. and approaches to begin to manage that. And I think
Well,
you reflected on much of that in your green discussion.
yes, yeah, exactly. And there's another great Urban Land Institute publication about frankly, the business case for green infrastructure. And they have a lot of examples that where people have put in, well, we have to have the parking lot, but how do we either have some elements of porosity there and or we cant it towards a rain garden? I mean, there are lots of different techniques and more all the time. How do we deal with that? The heat one is going to continue to get to us, right? Phoenix is experimenting with painting things white, right? Our surfaces, right? I mean,
Yes.
Philadelphia, I think, was the first one. Baltimore did a surface asset plan. They just looked at all the surfaces, almost like flying over 30,000 feet, realizing we manage all these surfaces and they have impacts whether we decide we wanted them or not. And so those are very reasonable questions. But the stormwater thing, the runoff thing is very pretty easily answered. There's a lot of great information on stormwater infrastructure out there. The heat one is tougher, but again, in fact, one of the publications in there said, you know, Las Vegas has done a lot with trees, but frankly, the parking lots completely overwhelm the gains from trees. So that's kind of tossing it back to our friends over in the transportation world. Transportation has to step up and see about how do they help us with some of these other environmental impacts.
Another question, thank you. How can we better incentivize natural wastewater treatment and stormwater management? Many developers are just trying to earn profit and are not interested in spending more. So I think part of the answer to that is the requirements now for better stormwater management for infiltration. I always wonder, people don't begin to couple these elements, but we know that the rainfall that infiltrates into our landscape becomes part of the base flow of our streams. So as more and more areas shift to a green infrastructure, bioswale, ground infiltration strategies for stormwater, we're likely to see the health of streams improve. So
absolutely, absolutely. Well, that's why I had that one little slide showing, rivers, soil moisture. Again, if we would back up to the entire water cycle, we have a lot more resources at our if we would understand that. And so when we think about it, all has to come treated from a pipe, we really, really limit our options. And so Pacific Institute, another NGO out of California, and from the time that Mary Ann was there, done a fantastic report on just the potential. If we look at water efficiency, water reuse, and stormwater capture, what might we gain from that urban environments? And the numbers are unbelievable. Now, it doesn't happen overnight, but it's, again, one of those things out there to help us broaden what our ranges are, right? So I had I come from a generational mentor, Gilbert White, in the 1900s, said, we need to look at the range of choice. If it's what's the next treated pipe that's going to serve us, we're really, really looking at our options, right? And so you're right. All those things are going to become important. Reuse, all that stuff.
There's a comment here. The city of Raleigh has adopted over 27 new codes, ordinances, and standards to allow and promote green stormwater infrastructure. And there's a link here. We'll send that around to folks. And we see that in many cities,
and you know that, Bill, and that's, planning 101. That's why I put in there.
Right.
You all know the codes and ordinances is what shapes the look of our city. And we've got what we have today because we said at one point that's what we want. And if that is going to change, the good news is students like to hear the 20-year-olds, it's not all done. We can change that, right? City of Tucson is the only one I know that has a requirement for transportation. Hey, you want to build a new roadway? The first inch of rainfall has to be captured by your own transportation green infrastructure. That's unheard of.
Well, you've anticipated the next question, which is, have studies been made about water use optimization and capture along freeways and roadways?
Yes.
And that's the answer. How about improving ecological functions in rural and natural landscapes to help the water system in concert with urban improvements? So now we're looking at maybe the T1, 2 of your transect. And it was interesting that you showed an urban transect because my problem, I love the concept that Duane advanced with the urban transect, but there's no water element in the urban transect. You see little trees pop up here and there.
Right.
but
Right.
I would love to see a water environment. So
Well,
anyway,
no, they,
back to
the,
ecological functions in rural space. Yeah.
no, they do. And again, that's the broader range. I was trying to looking for something. Toronto's been a great one. This actually, even now Milwaukee, which has a very, very advanced water council that's almost completely driven by the business community. We don't have a strong water future. We don't have a strong economy. And so more and more people are realizing that. So they are now, with their wastewater agency, investing in farms in the upper watershed to keep our agriculture and our natural areas to the service. The New York City is the best example of that, right? But ironically, as this water city kind of developed in those different fractionated things I show. In South America, where they didn't have anything, the Nature Conservancies kind of set up the integrated one out of the gate. So you pay your water bill in Lima, you're paying for the protection of that natural area, right? And so that's where the One Water regulates, we have to kind of do that, have more in common with those systems, because we literally all are working together.
So, Bill, can we jump to the garden in a box questions? Because there are a number of people who want more information on garden in a box if they don't live in Colorado.
Can you answer that question?
That would be a Paul question.
Okay, all right.
So there's the NGO here, and I'm proud to say I was part of helping that start. It celebrated its 20th anniversary. Resource Central. It's based in Boulder, Colorado. They have a program called Garden in the Box. And I will admit, like anyone else in conservation, I borrowed the idea from the Denver Botanic Gardens, who said, boy, what if we put all the plants together? Because that seems to be a hurdle for people. Well, we got that. And again, if you go to their website, you'll see they're having their spring sale right now. They have 5 different designs. They all give the name of the landscape designer on there. They show you what's going to be. You go, you pick up the thing, you come home and plant by number. They actually even do the turf replacement now, because that was a hurdle for people, right? So again, this program went from 2003 with 200 boxes to last year was over 12,000. And this year they've already sold out.
So how does somebody get access to a garden in a box if they don't live in Colorado? Is that possible?
It's well, again, that would either you'd have to ship it, which is probably the thing. But the reality is, in talking to there's a lot of native plant societies. So the Chicago Native Plant Society, for example, has a very big. They have a native plant sale, and again, every year they sell out. So the Theodore Payne Foundation in Los Angeles, right? And so I would start there with your native plant foundations. I would call Resource Central if you want, because the reality is not surprising. They're getting questions from all over the country. Wow, this is great. How do we do this in Dallas, right? Because it's one of those things, not to institutionalize it, but on the other hand, there's a lot of reproducible elements in our urban areas. And if we can kind of plug and play, that helps bring some things to scale. And so they might be able to help you with that.
Another question here about green infrastructure looks great when first installed, but how can we ensure it will be maintained? And I know that at least in this region, the requirements in stormwater management now does also require implementation of green infrastructure, and it requires a maintenance plan be developed as a part of any new development. I guess the question would be, for the general palette of green infrastructure and suite of green infrastructure that's being installed, how do we help assure maintenance?
Well, great question, because the reality is today we don't maintain urban landscapes. I live in Boulder, Colorado. Our common areas, our medians are terrible, right? And as cities really struggle with that, they often go. So again, unless there's a coordinate ordinance that says thou shalt have it, and that's not uncommon for cities, we typically only have replacement funds for computers and cars, right? All the other infrastructure, we hope there'll be a bond later. New Braunfels, Texas, of all places, this little small community had a very, very cutting edge woman who was the stormwater engineer, who's now the assistant city manager, put in place when they adopted the green infrastructure. There's going to be 3% of our annual fund that goes to maintenance, right? You got to build it in or it doesn't happen.
You've got to build it in.
And I totally recognizing that. And I've asked people over and over again, Philadelphia included, going, well, that was great. At the end of the day, at least a centralized system, I can see the things falling apart. If there's 11,000 rain gardens, how do we keep track of that? Well, again, you have to have both people to monitor and manage it, and you have to pay for it. You have to pony in that maintenance. And again, I don't want to burden green infrastructure or these climate-friendly landscape things only with that, because we don't do it now. As I always say, the built environment, everything's up to the CO, the certificate of occupancy, and then everybody goes away. Well, that's day one for those of us who work outdoors, right? And so we have another paradigm shift. How do we begin to do that? How do we follow that of Philadelphia, New Braunfels, those places will realize that is our infrastructure. We need to have a funding mechanism.
And I think that the early experiences, didn't benefit from us understanding some of these issues when they're, placed in the urban environment. And
Yep,
I see a lot of improvements in design and
absolutely.
plantings that are leading to lower maintenance. And my concern is that the early higher maintenance costs are going to scare away some future users. I expect that maintenance costs that are being encountered now will be much lower than the
Right.
first
Right,
implementations out
right.
of the
Well,
box.
right. Well,
Yeah,
again,
and there
there's some tremendous research going on that. A lot of people spending time and money on that. And again, the Green Infrastructure Leadership Exchange is another group of people who run those programs. They're on top of the latest literature. Exactly what you said, Bill. Yeah, we've learned. Yeah, the old costs used to be up here, but guess what? When we go back and we do it the right way, they're penciling out. But again, here's how you make that transition. Here's what you invest in,
Exactly.
because like anything, in your house, you wait too long, well, then the replacement is way more
Is
costly.
much higher. Yes.
Sorry, Marianne, I
Um,
cut you off.
Sure.
but I see it's 2:26. I suspect that we might be good to cut it off here. And um, there are
There's
some
just there was
questions.
one question about homeowners associations that I just wanted to give Paul a chance to talk about the
Okay,
work that
sure.
environmental
Yeah,
incentives does, because
we have
they
time for
work with
one more.
homeowners
Yeah.
associations. Yeah.
Right. Well, I
So,
appreciate you
so
bringing
there's the
that up
last question.
because HOAs are a reality. New homes in Colorado, I can't speak. I think it was one of the homes of special districts. Over 50% of new homes, more than 50% of the people in Colorado live in an HOA. So they are a reality. Now, that being said, if we march them the right way, there could be a great agency for change. So environmental incentives works with homeowner associations. And again, they're not all the same, but like you said, champions, you get a few people, it travels pretty quickly through the HOA grapevine. Oh, have you worked with environmental incentives? They really helped us not only reduce our
Get
water use,
money
people get
and get
money,
grants.
get
Mhm.
grants. People are excited about it. They love the new flower, those kind of things. Western Resource Advocates in Colorado literally just produced a publication in the last month of opportunities for HOA. So the whole idea looking at, can we take that quote central governance, although it's a pretty small scale, they have a lot of control there, and actually plug that in with some trying to create some of these climate friendly things. And you're right. The good news is if they can speak for 200 homeowners, they can go get money. That's a
Yeah.
scale a lot of people want to play in.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone that attended today. It was quite a thorough and extremely detailed session. Thank you for your attention. We're going to try to summarize some of these questions that we didn't get to and get some answers out. And again, on behalf of Christine and everyone here, thank you. And Paul, great presentation.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Christine. Thank you all, APA. Keep it going.
And look at the original document that's posted at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.